Hello everyone. It has been well over a month since I last recorded a Nietzsche video, and yeah, I don't really have more explanation to say than that other than things got a little crazy, and I think going forward I'll probably need to find a new format for doing this because I was finding a decrease in my motivation. I suspect that's because when I started, I originally thought I was just going to start right off with Zarathustra, but then I was like, no, I'll do some intro, and then the intro kind of just kept compounding, and I think by the time I actually started with commentary on Zarathustra, there was a part of me that felt like I had already done what I ultimately wanted to do, which was that series of videos on Nietzsche, even though they're all just supposed to be introductory. In any case, I don't want it to stop there because I feel like I have quite a bit to say. And this is, as one friend pointed out to me, a sort of a test run for the book I would eventually like to write. Or really, this is basically my way of drafting that book project or figuring it out how I want to do it. So anyway, I'm just figuring it out, so sorry about the long delay. I can't promise I'll have a video out next week, but I've had this script sitting and I finished it up, and so I will deliver it, and that will at least finish off the first section of the prologue of the Spake Zarathustra. And then ideally I would just move on to the next part. So we'll see how it goes. And I hope you enjoy this one. So I'm going to actually go ahead and reread Zarathustra's speech to the sun in full. O thou great star, what of thy joy hadst thou not they whom thou dost lighten? 10 years thou came up hither to my cave. Thou wouldst of thy light and this way have been sated without me, my eagle and my serpent. But we awaited thee each morning, took from thee thine overflow, and for it blessed thee. Lo, I am with my wisdom overladen, like a bee that of the honey hath gathered too much. I too have need of hands outstretched. I want to pour out and to give away, till the wise among men once again of their folly, and the poor once again of their riches rejoice. For this must I into the depths climb, as thou doest at eventide, when thou goest behind the sea, and even to the underworld bringest light, thou over-wealthy star. Like thee I must set, as the humans call it, to whom I would descend. So bless me then, thou tranquil eye, who without envy canst behold an all too great felicity. Bless the cup that would overflow, that water golden from it flow, and everywhere a mirror bear of thy delight. Lo, this cup would again become empty, and Zarathustra would again become human. Zarathustra has spent 10 years gathering the overflow of the sun, like a bee gathering nectar from a sunflower. This nectar he has made into golden honey, or wisdom. Now, like a tear in a cascading fountain, Zarathustra himself is overflowing with wisdom, and needs lower tears to catch his overflow as it spills over the edge. His desire to love others is born out of his own overflowing self-love. He wants to disseminate himself, like Jesus becoming bread and wine for his disciples, or Dionysus becoming meat and drink for his disciples. He wants to distribute himself and thus perish in giving his riches, which are himself, away. He learned all this from watching the sun rise and set each day. Thus he says, "For this, my distributive sacrifice, must I into the depths climb, as thou doest at eventide when thou goest behind the sea, and even to the underworld bringest light, thou overwealthy star." The sun ascends to the highest pitch or zenith of the sky, and then climbs back down to the western horizon. From there it descends below the horizon into the depths, for mythologically speaking, it continues its cycle down to the opposite pitch of the zenith, the very abyss of the universe. From there, it begins its reascent, appearing in the morning on the eastern horizon. The sun dies, goes to the underworld, or hell, but even there continues to shine. This is very reminiscent of the old Christian idea that Christ, immediately following his death, descended to hell, or the underworld, and rescued all the righteous souls trapped there in consequence of Adam's curse. Christ's sacrifice does not just redeem the present and the future, but also justifies the past, to the point of changing the meaning of the past. The dead are redeemed. If only we moderners held this attitude towards our own ancestors, but few seem willing to forgive the dead their inadequacy, perhaps because they do not forgive their own inadequacy, either because they hate themselves or because in order to avoid hating themselves, they effectively repress all knowledge of their own faults. Sorry, psychoanalyzing there, but it's an interesting idea I just thought up while writing this. In any case, Zarathustra declares that, like the sun, he must untergehen. Literally, this means go under, but that English phrase does not capture the full connotation of the German. Perhaps the best image for untergehen, at least in the context of Zarathustra, is the word set, as in a setting sun or moon or star. But note how this word can also connote perishing or simply vanishing altogether. So you have the idea of sinking below the horizon, and thus also the idea of a ship sinking below the waves. In any event, the word is about ending, death, dissipation, even ruin. Thus, it is very interesting that Zarathustra adds, as the humans call it. The word untergehen, which I translate as set here, is a human word for what Zarathustra is doing. It is not necessarily Zarathustra's word. From a human perspective, Zarathustra is setting, like the sun. He is falling, he is going down, he is dying, he is perishing. But that is only one perspective on the matter. As Zarathustra already said of the sun, it does not literally die and vanish on the horizon, only for a new sun to be born the next day. Rather, the rising sun and the setting sun are the same sun. But where then does the sun go? Of course, we know scientifically that the sun doesn't really go anywhere, it's just the Earth rotating around, but I'm speaking mythologically here, and there shall be plenty more to say on the mythology infused in science when Zarathustra starts talking about poets much later on in the book. Mythologically, anyway, the sun goes below the horizon and thereby enters another world, the underworld. To the inhabitants of this underworld, the sun's setting is actually a dawning. It is worth noting, by the way, that Zarathustra speaks of the sun going hinter, or behind the sea. This will be relevant later when Zarathustra speaks of the behind-worlders, or Hinterweltlern, those who believe existence is only justified by means of a super-existence which stands behind it. Zarathustra seems very clear in that speech that such a behind world does not exist, and yet he speaks here of the sun going behind the sea and entering another world. Perhaps it is just an inconsistency, but I have a hunch there might be something more profound going on here. But in any case, Zarathustra acknowledges that the ordinary human perspective is limited in regards to his actions. It is not untrue that he is setting, sinking, perishing, by giving up his pleasant solitude in the mountains and returning to humankind to distribute of his wisdom and person, but it is only one side of the coin. This parallels the relationship of Jesus with his own disciples, who could not understand what he meant when he told them that his trajectory, as far as this world is concerned, was not an enthronement, but a crucifixion. And yet his crucifixion on the earth would correspond to or lead to an enthronement in the heavens. Thus, like the sun, Jesus sets and goes down behind the sea only to bring light to the underworld and then dawn again in the mortal realm on its third day. In the Antichrist, Nietzsche portrays Jesus as a symbolist. That's the word he uses. A symbolist who is trying to convey an inner experience of salvation to a people utterly ruled by the external. For Jesus, the external relates to the internal as a symbol relates to its meaning. Thus, the external event of his crucifixion is simultaneously and imminently his enthronement in the kingdom of heaven, because he died without resistance or ill will for those who killed him, and thus conquered the world and death in his own person. That at least is my understanding of my extrapolation of what I think Nietzsche's take would be given what he says in the Antichrist. He never says any of that explicitly, but the way he talks about Jesus being a symbolist and the meaning of his death on the cross, it seems pretty clearly implied. But you can read it and judge for yourself. By the way, note also that, at least according to Mark, Jesus endured crucifixion from between approximately what we would call 9 a.m. in the morning to 3 p.m. in the afternoon. And it was at 3 p.m. when he reportedly died. So that's 6 hours through the heat of the day, with the peak being at noon, when the sky was ironically darkened until 3 o'clock. The cause of that darkening, you could say it's an eclipse, though there's a lot of reasons why it obviously could not be a natural eclipse, the biggest problem being that it lasted so long, according to the report, but that's not what we're talking about here. The point is he remained on the cross dead until evening, because normally he actually died much faster than was normal for people being crucified. And it was only at evening when his friends obtained permission to take his body down and lay it in a tomb, right, during evening, thus completing the setting of the Son of God. Regardless, none of this was understood, as symbolically anyway, until the resurrection, and it took time for it to sink in even then what had just happened. Jesus had, as the humans call it, set. He was done, finished. He passed behind the horizon into that region from whence, supposedly, no man returns. In the speech on reading and writing, and as the epigram opening Book 3 of Zarathustra, Zarathustra declares, quote, "Whoso climbeth on the highest mountains doth laugh over all morning games and morning gravity." That is, mourning in the sense of weeping, being sad for the death of somebody. So, from a sufficiently high vantage point, all tragedy is really comedy. But why is this so? Is this just due to the pitilessness of the onlooker? Is Nietzsche merely encouraging laughter at another's suffering in order to make yourself feel better about the chaos of the universe? It goes deeper than that. I think it's pretty clear. Laughter is an essential tonic for the depressive tragedy of existence, so that is a part of it. And one must first of all be capable of laughing at oneself and one's own troubles. We already discussed in the introduction how, for Nietzsche, pity can quickly become a condemnation of life as such, a sort of vengeance on the sufferer's behalf. But beyond even all of this, there is a far more profound reason for this apparent callousness from that statement. For why is it that one must reach a high vantage point before laughter is possible? It must be that tragedy does not look so tragic from a bird's eye view. Why would this be so? I suggest it is for the same reason that human beings would say Zarathustra is setting rather than Zarathustra is dawning. From the mountaintops, you can see things in terms of the eternal recurrence, meaning you see all events as points on the circumference of a great circle. There is no beginning or end. These must be arbitrarily set by some convention. Therefore, there is no absolute reason to regard birth as the beginning of a man's existence and death as its end. In fact, there is no proper beginning or end to a man's existence. Any event in his life may serve equally well as the beginning and the end, once we accept that his life runs in a perfect circle. A final note on these two lines. A very brief note, Zarathustra refers to, quote, the humans to whom I would descend, unquote. And I just wanted to point out that it's hard not to see the parallels with the whole notion of the condescension of God in order to rescue humankind as Jesus Christ. Many, 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 many connections to Jesus Christ. All right, so moving on to the next line. So bless me then, thou tranquil eye, who without envy canst behold an all too great felicity. The sun is not envious of Zarathustra. They are two self-sufficient beings, capable of admiration without jealousy. This is a remarkable thing. Admiration, as a general rule, entails an unconscious envy. In fact, that is usually all it is. Unconscious envy sublimated into flattery, both as a means of defense and of indirect offense. When you admire someone, this far too often entails that you actually fear them somewhat. You acknowledging that they are superior to you in some respect, and therefore they have a right to judge you as wanting in this or that area. So you defend yourself by confessing your admiration, usually through flattery. The false kindness of flattery puts the flattered person in your debt, so they are more likely to flatter you in return, thus bolstering one's already weak self-esteem, which led to the envy in the first place. That's a very Nietzschean psychological analysis of something that is often taken to be unquestioningly a good thing. Admiration, what's the problem there? It's a very Nietzschean analysis. I did not take this directly from Nietzsche. It's sort of, I call it Nietzschean because it's my analysis of admiration, but it's one that I think Nietzsche could have easily given. If you'll pardon a little tangent here just to hammer this out. I'm going off script here, but in comparison with Nietzsche, as I'm sure you can tell, I'm much more recognizably optimistic. I consider Nietzsche to ultimately be a kind of optimist, though I doubt he would much care for that characterization, but I don't know what else to call him. He's just not recognizably optimistic because he hides it all the time. But say with concepts like friendship or admiration, or actually probably one of the clearest examples we'll get to later in Zarathustra would be Nietzsche's discussion of marriage. There it is perfectly clear that he really does believe in a kind of ideal marriage relationship that I think is actually quite beautiful. But his critique is that it's extremely difficult to obtain that level, and one should not be deceived about the fact of where the raw emotional materials that it came from. Nietzsche, in the beginning of Beyond Good and Evil, and also throughout Zarathustra, he emphasizes this notion of in some sense, all good things, they don't just come out of nowhere. They are forged out of raw materials that are anything but the lovely, refined things that we call good. So, lust, envy, hatred, power-seeking, all these sorts of things. Everything that we have that is good has to be forged out of those materials. It's not an opposition. It comes out of them. This is a very important Nietzschean idea, this level of degree between what we traditionally call good and evil. So I mention all of that because in my analysis here of admiration, it would be a similar kind of thing, that one should not think that admiration as felt naturally, as felt without any like effort of psychoanalysis on one's own part or of trying to really figure out what's at the bottom of your admiration, is very unlikely to be true admiration with a capital A that we would associate with, the highest saintly levels of human experience, right? It's far more likely to be something that's extremely flawed and problematic for the reasons that I've tried to lay out here. So that, I think, I'll need to talk more about this in the future, but that I think is what a Nietzschean psychological analysis is truly all about, is about basically showing, hey, listen, you're not far enough along in your refinement yet. You're still, as he'll say later, you're still too much of a monkey, would be one way of him putting it. But anyway, those are just some thoughts. Continuing on. In short, what we call admiration is far too often a symptom of weakness or of lacking self-confidence. In other words, genuine admiration, or envy-free admiration, is a very rare and precious thing, requiring that one already have a secure self-identity, that one not feel that they are lacking in anything. And yet, this feeling of lacking, of fundamental inadequacy, is part of the very definition of human being, who is the sick animal, as we talked about in an earlier episode. To overcome this sense of lack and thus become capable of true admiration would require that one become something more than, something over and above human being. That is, something superhuman. The admiration felt between Zarathustra and the sun is of this kind. It does not entail the entanglements of envy. Zarathustra is secure in himself. He no longer needs to seek for himself. In Beyond Good and Evil, section 266, Nietzsche quotes Goethe. However, he lays emphasis upon one word in this Goethe quotation, and by doing so, by putting one word in italics, Nietzsche fundamentally transforms the whole connotation of the passage. It's a brilliant maneuver on his part. And in order to try to convey what he's done here, I'm going to read the quote without the emphasis, and then I will read it with Nietzsche's emphasis. So I'm going to give you the original Goethe quote and then Nietzsche's emphasized version. So the original Goethe quote, "Truly high respect one can have only for those who do not seek themselves," unquote. But Nietzsche renders it thus: truly high respect one can have only for those who do not seek themselves. The emphasis is on seek. Without that emphasis, the quote seems to express a straightforwardly altruistic sentiment, right? It's a classic notion of the true great person is someone who's altruistic, who does not seek themselves. They seek for the welfare of others, right? They are not self-seeking. But Nietzsche transforms it into something, well, Nietzschean. Respect is due those who do not seek themselves precisely because they have already found themselves. They know who they are, where their felicity comes from, and they are not seeking to complete themselves in other people, but rather they complete other people through themselves, through their own found fullness. This is another theme throughout Zarathustra, the dictum that true marriage or friendship, for as Nietzsche says elsewhere, the only basis for a good and lasting marriage is genuine friendship, is not about two halves clinging together in order to make a whole between them, as Aristophanes would have it in Plato's Symposium, but rather two wholes combining together, like in a chemical reaction, in order to form a new whole. Two atoms make up a molecule. Love ought not to be a dependency, but a voluntary sacrifice of independence for the sake of creating something beautiful and new between two people. Marriage is not and should not be treated as a fix for one's problems, as a way to complete oneself. It shouldn't be a solution. Rather, it is the privilege of those who have already found the solution for themselves. That, at least, is the teaching of Nietzsche, according to Michael Pierce. So that's my take on what Nietzsche's getting at. We'll get into that later when we get to those. I feel like I'm saying that a lot, but we'll get into that later. There is a statement from the prophet Joseph Smith, another figure who I quote a lot in this series and will be quoting quite a bit later on. It's to the effect that once one has confirmed that God is real, the next step is to seek for whether one's way of life is pleasing before him. I can't find the original quote for this. I wish I could, but I know it's out there somewhere. So if you know where it is, please tell me in the comments below. But the point here is, note that getting oneself right with God is not the whole journey for Joseph Smith. That's just one of the first steps in the journey. Cain never got beyond this step, and he envied Abel's achievement of it. By that I mean, Cain did not figure out what sacrifice was pleasing to the Lord. I see would-be monks and holy men in this land who are stunted in their spiritual power because they have never resolved this fundamental question. In fact, they think it is irresolvable, an unconquerable part of the human condition, to never know whether God is pleased with the trajectory of your life or not. God's intention, therefore, is apparently to keep everyone on their toes. This I cannot accept or believe. One is prevented from reaching their full potential if one never gets past this stage of personal uncertainty. That is not how we're supposed to live. So much of the human journey is about outgrowing grounds for doubt. Finally, I would like to quote from an alchemical text. Yes, one rediscovered during the Italian Renaissance. Sorry, I'm laughing. It's just I wrote this script a little while ago, and I'm like, wow, I really do say that. Isn't that? It's awesome. But yeah, it's known as the Asclepius. I think that's how you pronounce it. And it contains the alleged teachings of an Egyptian guru called Hermes Trismegistus. Hermes the thrice-born would be the rough translation as I understand it. Even my cursory acquaintance with the text leads me to suspect that Nietzsche was at least somewhat familiar with it, particularly this passage, which you're going to see later on. Or if you've watched my video about the plot of the Spake Zarathustra, it should be very clear to you what this has to do with Zarathustra and with some of Nietzsche's thinking in general. So let's just get into quoting it. Quote, "In that hour, weary of life, men will no longer regard the world as the worthy object of their admiration and reverence. This all, which is a good thing, the best that can be seen in the past, the present, and the future, will be in danger of perishing. Men will esteem it a burden, and thenceforward this whole of the universe will be despised and no longer cherished. This incomparable work of God, this glorious construction, this all-good creation made up of an infinite diversity of forms, this instrument of the will of God who, without envy, lavishes his favor upon his work, in which is assembled in one all, in a harmonious diversity, all that can be seen, which is worthy of reverence, praise, and love." Unquote. That is, the translation is taken from Francis Yates' Giordano Bruno and the Hermetic Tradition, which is a fascinating book. I haven't finished reading it, but it's very, very good. And this is one of the earlier chapters that talks about the Asclepius. So you can check that out. But I'm sure you can see why I would quote that. For one, because you have the direct reference to the idea of a God who, without envy, lavishes his favor upon his work. That's like literally what Nietzsche says. Not literally what he says, but the idea of looking upon someone's happiness, lavishing them with admiration without envy. It's the same idea. And then also just this whole notion of people, the whole world being in danger of perishing because people will esteem life as a burden. Later on in Zarathustra, we're going to get a section. It's actually in Book 2, The Soothsayer, where you have this prophet, this soothsayer, who basically says what the Asclepius says here, predicts that people will be weary of living in the future, weary of living in a very profound and non-trivial way. I mean, not that it would ever be trivial, but anyway, so I just thought that was very interesting. For the final section, I'm going to go ahead and read the last two lines of the speech that he gives, and then there's a final line I'll go over briefly. Bless the cup that would overflow, that water golden from it flow, and everywhere a mirror bear of thy delight. Lo, this cup would again become empty, and Zarathustra would again become human. In connection with these two lines, I will quote from Ludwig Feuerbach's short work, The Essence of Religion. Feuerbach, who lived from 1804 to 1872, so in later life he was technically a contemporary with Nietzsche, but Nietzsche didn't really start his serious thought till later, till after Feuerbach was dead. Nevertheless, Feuerbach was one of the major influences on the young Nietzsche's thought. And Feuerbach writes, quote, "The deepest disgrace of any being is death, but the source of death is the act of begetting. To beget is nothing but to throw one's self away, to make one's self common, to be lost among the multitude, to sacrifice one's singleness and exclusiveness to other beings." Unquote. That's section 19 of The Essence of Religion. This quote is a major motif in Zarathustra. In fact, reading this quote alone made a number of passages of Zarathustra instantly make far more sense to me. This idea that creation requires the sacrifice, and a particular kind of sacrifice, right? This making common, this dissemination, it's a sacrifice, the setting of the Creator, the bequeathment of the Creator's power and their life force to his or her creation. In short, the sacrifice of a parent on behalf of their child, a giving up of your own life force on behalf of the child. Or alternatively, we have the insistence of John the Baptist that his setting, John the Baptist's setting, corresponds with and allows for the rising or the dawn of Jesus Christ, who, despite coming after John, and in some sense relying upon John, even being in some sense like a child of John, is nevertheless superior to John. It's the same sentiment. This image is essential to Zarathustra and to Nietzsche's thought in general. The image of someone giving their all to produce a work of art, or to produce another being, or to bring about anything, something greater than themselves, even to the point of making the ultimate sacrifice to bring it to life, collapsing at the canvas, as it were, as soon as you have finished your masterwork, because it took so much out of you, right? Beyond this, however, this image, there is also Feuerbach's characterization of this sacrificial death as a sacrifice of one's individuality specifically. So it's not just a matter of like stamina. There's something deeper going on here. One makes oneself common and is lost among the multitude. When the artist creates their work, they are putting themselves into a form communicable to other people, or at the very least, to another person. The moment that the work is seen by another person, much more the moment it is understood by another person, is the moment that the artist to some degree or other, perishes, and the artwork lives on beyond them in the public sphere. It has been disseminated. It is no longer the artist's own. It is no longer a pure and perfect idea in the private mind. It has been scattered to the four winds to enrich foreign soils and hopefully make others fruitful, or to be misunderstood and rejected and mangled by other people. When it was in production, the artwork was an embryo, a fetus joined with the mother's body by a placenta and an umbilical cord. But upon birth, this child is brought into the public world, the placenta is removed, and the cord is cut. Zarathustra's plan to return to humankind is a death in this sense. He is going to make himself public, and in that respect sacrifice himself. He is going to become human, which means he is going to become common. He's going to be born, effectively. He wants to overflow and thus become empty, like the womb emptying itself of the child, and this overflow will bear the face of the Son, who was its father. For Zarathustra spent 10 years in the mountains receiving seed from the sun and gestating a child there. Now the vine blood of his cup, which as the psalm says runneth o'er, becomes a mirror, reflecting the sunlight as it spreads out across the ground where it was spilt. It is a marvelous image that Nietzsche has here constructed. It's one of the most beautiful lines in Zarathustra, in my opinion. And now we come upon the final line of the prologue passage of section 1 of the prologue. So after Zarathustra has given this speech to the sun, there's just one more line that follows, namely, "Thus began Zarathustra's setting." This process of setting will not be completed until the end of Book 3, after Zarathustra's confrontation with the eternal recurrence. So it's a very poignant line, and this notion of Zarathustra's setting will recur throughout the story. So thank you for joining me on this little excursion into Zarathustra. Well, it's not really a little excursion, but yeah, we'll be moving on to section 2. Again, I don't know if that will be coming out next week, and I might be figuring out a slightly different way of doing this because this will take way too long and I don't want to burn myself out. But yeah, we'll figure it out. Thank you for listening. I hope you found this useful and enjoyable, and I will see you in the next video.